This is a reading of the last part of the Theaetetus II, or the second Theaetetus, which I am the author of, and which is a sequel to Plato's Sophist and Statesman dialogues, and is thus subtitled The Philosopher. And this is also a sequel to Plato's Theaetetus. Now I say that Plato foretold this dialogue through hints in the opening passages of the Sophist and Statesman dialogues, of a continuation of the discussion to illustrate the nature of the philosopher after the Sophist and Statesman. That there are various references that indicate that the discussion was continued. And so this should be thought of as almost a spurious dialogue, as there is a place for this dialogue within the corpus of Plato. Now, this will be a continuation of the reading, which left off with the mathematician being compelled to admit that there is a science above mathematics, above arithmetic and geometry, and that is the philosopher's science. That dialectic is above mathematics, which was important to make clear, because not only is mathematics, and especially geometry, the exemplar of demonstrative science, of syllogistic reasoning and proofs. But mathematics and mathematicians are wont to claim that metaphysics is not a science, and that everything that we accuse the sophist of equally applies to the philosopher. That is the position that the mathematician is throughout the ages accustomed to hold. And since, again, in the first portion of this dialogue, we were able to separate the philosopher from sophism and rhetoric, from the sophist and the rhetorician, only by having recourse to mathematics and that kind of demonstrative reason, of syllogistic argument. We are able to distinguish the philosopher with recourse to the mathematician. Then afterwards, we had to compel the mathematician that there is such a science as dialectic that is above and in command of the theoretical sciences. That indeed has difficulty distinguishing itself from the sophist and the rhetorician and the like forms of persuasion and knowledge, without the mathematician, without that as an exemplar of what proof and argument should look like. So after compelling the mathematician that dialectic is the leader of the theoretical sciences, we now enter the part of the dialogue that begins to verge more on logic and other interesting problems. One significant of which is that if the dialectician is a master in refutation and can prove the falsity of what other people say by questioning them and by cross-examining them, pointing out that they contradict themselves, pointing out that their claims result in contradictions, which is useful for, as Socrates repeats, sort of reducing people to not thinking that they know more than they know, but thinking that they know only what they know. That is the way that dialectic is described as a purifying art of being able to, by cross-examining somebody, showing them that the opinions they hold are self-contradictory and that they don't know what they think they know, which otherwise they would never admit. Now, that being the case, we will find that the sophist has a challenge and will say, well, if your dialectic or skill in refutation can, by showing contradiction, show that a proposition is false, or that something that someone else says is not true, and that is a whole scope of dialectic, then refutation and dialectic are only concerned with falsehood and what is not, rather than truth and being. And that is the difficulty that we will have to navigate through at the end of this reading. Which will have recourse to logic and the law of the excluded middle, or what gets called that, and the principle of non-contradiction, which is practically the same thing. And the law of included middle, which is displayed in the symposium, as well as perhaps elsewhere. But that is not considered by the moderns to be a law of logic. And we will talk about different kinds of opposition, that there are contradictories, and that there are contraries with something between them, like more and less and equal. And that we have to reduce a problem to contradictories, where one of the opposites is the negation of the other, or the opposites negate each other. Those sorts of things will arise in the course of this in the course of this reading. So I will overlap slightly with where we left off. Then will the mathematician surrender the science of being and truth as a whole? And will he admit that there is a theoretical science prior to arithmetic and geometry? Or will he unravel these problems? I think he would be relieved to turn away from these seemingly indefinite problems and turn back to his definite conclusions. You speak well, at least, to call it turning back to conclusions, as we were trying to reach not a conclusion, but a principle in the opposite way. What then is next? We can leave the mathematician for now and continue with the introduction of changing things as real. Maybe we should turn from being to truth and see if we can't advance there, as what is real and what is true are the same things, the latter only having the admixture of speech or thought, and take up the track there, since those are always together, and see if we aren't relieved of some of the obstructions we have to contend with in the investigation of being. I want to say that this is a maneuver that in metaphysics is useful because the investigation of what being is and what beings are can become obscure. And we can turn to truth and investigate what are the properties of truth? What kinds of truth are there? Truths that are provable? Are there truths that are not provable? Because truth is merely the addition of speech or thought to being, as what is true is what is that we speak truly if what we say corresponds to how things really are. And a true thought is a thought that corresponds to reality or to being, while a false thought does not correspond to how things really are or to what is real. False speech is false by not corresponding to real and being. And truth is somewhat more easier to discern, perhaps. And those can be interchanged. Our course for the investigation of being can turn towards truth to elucidate the nature of being, and vice versa. And that real, all three of those terms are sort of mutually dependent. That if the course towards identifying and comprehending one of them is easier, we can take that course in order to shed light on the other two, on being and truth, or being and reality, or what is real. And so that is the course we are taking now, because we had somewhat exhausted the investigation of what being and what being is and what beings are. We look to how we speak of things as true, as corresponding to our speech, as corresponding to how things are. And as falsity, as false speech corresponds to how things are not. That is all right with me. I would be relieved to find an easier path in this investigation. Do we not speak of things truly if what we say corresponds to how those things really are? And as untrue, when what we say doesn't correspond to how things really are. Yes, that is our usual way of speaking. And even if we make a difference between true things said about things that come to be and pass away, and true things said about things that don't come to be or pass away, but always are such, is there not also a significant difference between true and false in temporary things that refuses us to cut changing things from truth and falsity? Yes, the word true is thrown around about things said about almost every kind of occurrence. Then let's take a common question, one that's on the lips of every citizen here. What time is it? Say someone asks us that. Say someone asks that to us. What time is it? Whether of what era, what year, what month, what day, or what hour of the day. Let's imagine he asks us what hour of the day it is. And imagine the person asking us has been sleeping off in a heavy, unmixed draft and really doesn't know if he has woken up to the beginning of the day or the end of the day, but only sees the colors bleeding up from the horizon. He may be some visitor to the city that is unfamiliar with the directions of the sun's rising and setting and has just awoken from sleeping off the heavy draft, or be some familiar local with his clothes covered in his own spilled drink, like a Thracian. In either case, imagine we tell him whether it is sunrise or sunset. Would he not, no matter how lost he is, at least think there is a true and a false response to the question whether it is sunrise or sunset? Of course. And if we told him that it was sunrise, and the colors in the sky soon faded into night and its decorative constellations, he would just as soon run back to scold us for fooling him, would he not? He would. Now consider this. Would you deny that the question, what is the hour of the day, is about things that come to be and pass away? Or would you say that the time of day is always the same? Of course, the time of day is a passing event. Then true and false apply equally to things that come to be and pass away, as to those that always are. Is that right? That is right. And of health and disease. If two people disagree about whether one of them or someone else is healthy or diseased, do you think there is a truth and a falsity to the disputant's claims about health and disease? Or could the person in question be both healthy and diseased? Not in the same sense could they be both healthy and diseased. Then there is a truth and falsity to health and disease like there is of the time of the day or year? There is. But health and disease are passing states of the body, and any guarantee of the body's health at some given time doesn't likewise guarantee its health at every later date. Is that right? Yes. So again, truth and falsity apply not only to things that always are, but things that come to be and pass away, and things that have come to be and have passed away, or will come to be or pass away. I agree. Then we'll have to agree first that being is not definable, yet that we can say that much at least about it. And then also that it is one and many, or better yet, that it is neither, or some third thing besides them they are included in. And after that, we can say that changing things are also real. And finally, that the speculation about being itself is not a work of the mathematician, but of the philosopher. I can agree with that. And to continue, who will be responsible for answering to the problems raised about changeable things? Like what problems? I'm afraid we'll find more troubling problems in the class of changeable things than we have had to deal with about theoretical things that don't change, like shapes and numbers. Don't you see that mathematicians, philosophers, statesmen, and others too, all wade into the changeable class, some only up to their feet or waist, and some up to their necks, and some with their whole head and eyes and ears beneath the surface? Which one of them will answer to the question if all change is to and from opposites, or if things can change in some other way? And who will answer whether two things are generated from one thing, or if one thing is generated from two things? And if there is only linear, not circular alteration back and forth between qualities? And if there is circular as well as linear motion in space, in place? And if there is circular as well as linear motion in place? And if something can be in motion in place without altering in quality, and whether motion in place is primary and change of quality is secondary? I don't know who will answer those kinds of questions. Then consider, if the philosopher claims the domain of being, will he be split by the differentia of changing and not changing? Wasn't he supposed to be fixed in the theoretical rather than the practical world? And if being is his business, then he will be found chasing things outside of the theoretical world. Now, see if the same thing happens with rhetoricians and statesmen in regard to changeable things, as to what I am trying to say happens to the philosopher. In what sense? We should examine these others and see if the problems of the changeable world pose similar problems as they do to the philosopher. Okay. So, starting with the rhetorician, what affections will the rhetorician use for persuasion? Won't he have to know how to speak to affect the hearts and minds of the listeners, to make them like or not like something? Yes. And he will have to be able to affect passions in the dispositions of his listeners, such as sympathy, resentment, pride, shame, fear, excitement, relaxing, sadness, industriousness, bravery, friendship, and so on, to gain their opinion. Is that right? Yes, that is also right. And isn't the rhetorician's target the opinion of the crowd, and so not designed to the sentiments of some individual, but of the majority? Yes. And they would consider some one person in the crowd that disagrees as unworthy of notice, and concern themselves with persuading the majority of the crowd only. Yes. Would you then admit that the rhetorician feeds the passions of the crowd, if we take it as a given that he is after their approval? Yes, that is also how they seem to conduct themselves as far as I've seen. Now, set aside whether or not we approve of the passions of the crowd and how they are fed by rhetoricians, and consider if the subject of knowledge of rhetoric is the passions of the soul and how to affect them in speech. They would have to know that in order to affect changes in the dispositions of the crowd, yes. And to make them like or not like the topic of the speech, yes. He must be able to pull the strings of the hearts of his listeners like a puppeteer. Then as regards to the statesman, what alterations and affections are avoided or intended in the populace or state? That is a difficult question. In any case, won't he legislate prescriptions for the whole group and not for any particular individual that may stand out amongst the majority? Again, in any case, won't the statesman legislate prescriptions for the whole group and not for any particular individual that may stand out amongst the majority? Yes, the statesman may be said to steer the many or the crowd with legislation, as every prescription applies to everyone. Yes, a statesman may be said to steer the many or the crowd with legislation, as every prescription applies to everyone. And in that way, he is like the rhetorician, as both have the general populace as either their target audience or the aim of their legislation. It is true that neither rhetoricians nor statesmen persuade or prescribe laws for particular people rather than for the whole group. It is true that neither rhetoricians nor statesmen persuade or prescribe laws for particular people rather than for the whole group. And yet both have to know the affections of the soul. Isn't the soul involved in change both as moving and affecting other things, and as being affected and moved by other things? And the statesman and rhetorician have these changes in the disposition of the soul in focus. That is also true, but as regards to the majority especially. Now, do you see the difficulty with prescribing anything in general for the bodies or souls of the majority? Do you see the difficulty with prescribing anything in general for the bodies or souls of the majority? In what way? If the development of their bodies were in question, a gymnastics instructor would be restricting himself by only giving the whole group together a homogeneous regime. If the development of their bodies were in question, a gymnastics instructor would be restricting himself by only giving the whole group together a homogeneous regime. Or take the coordinate art, medicine, for example. How difficult it would be to prescribe anything for the health of everyone in the state, besides the most basic and rudimentary things. I see that a physician would only have a few simple rules that would apply to the majority generally, and that individuals would have to be taken separately to operate with any detail. The only use for that kind of general prescription would be if there is a plague that affects the majority, or if the public becomes generally unhealthy out of habit. And notice how most policies don't prescribe anything as regards the bodies of their citizens, with the exception of the institutions of Lycurgus and a few others. Yes, the Lacedaemonians are unique in that respect. Then let's move on to the soul and behavior in general, since that will be clearer for the topic of legislation, or we are limited to the Peloponnese. All right. Is there not the same difficulty with legislation as there is with medicine and gymnastics in prescribing some regimen for the benefit of the majority, primarily that is not advanced or sophisticated enough to benefit the best of the group? Again, is there not the same difficulty with legislation as there is with medicine and gymnastics in prescribing some regimen for the benefit of the majority primarily that is not advanced or sophisticated enough to benefit the best of the group? Yes, the statesman is in the same difficulty as the physician and the physical trainer in that respect. I think this is part of what isolates the philosopher. Don't you see that anyone that excels the standard for the majority, don't you see that anyone that excels the standard for the majority, don't you see that anyone that excels the standard of the majority prescribed by the lawgivers, and who requires much more training than the common course of discipline for the common herd, is compromised by the mediocrity of his society and the focus of the lawgivers and the education of his state on the benefit of the majority? Yes, I have seen firsthand how the best youths with the most potential are held back by their own training when it is aimed at a too mediocre end and serves more as a distraction than anything for their development. Then consider how many philosophers are exiles, or even if they live in the city or land that they were born in, that they are either willingly or unwillingly astray from the concerns of their state. Many philosophers meet that fate, you are right. Then who is responsible for prescribing the conduct of individuals outside of groups, especially those that stand out? Don't your friends' parents, Theaetetus, hire slaves to teach them and look out after their development? Yes. Well, and aren't there two ways of education? Which do you refer to? What the stranger mentioned, I refer to what the stranger mentioned either to you or to the younger Socrates. That first there is the common method of educating children by admonition, that is, by gifts and punishment. I remember that. And do you think that is any different than what dog trainers do with treats and the whip? No, I suppose it's the same with dogs and with children and even older folks. That encouragement and gifts are given to them to persuade them to keep doing something. And that punishment and shame are used to persuade them not to do something. What again, however, was the other way of education the statesman mentioned? That is what we are looking for. Do you remember that the sophist was in the 5th or 6th place called an expert at disputation? Do you remember that the sophist was in the 5th or 6th place called an expert at disputation? That the sophist was called an expert at disputation in your conversation with the Eleatic stranger? Yes, we said that. In any case, we acknowledge that there is such an art that disputes or refutes about all things, didn't we? And you said disputation is used to purge the soul. And you said disputation is used to purge the soul of ignorance, of thinking they know what they really don't know when they are talking nonsense. Again, we acknowledge that there is such an art that disputes or refutes about all things, didn't we? And you said disputation is used to purge the soul of ignorance, of thinking they know what they really don't know when they are talking nonsense. Yes, we said that. And we hesitated to give him that title. We admitted that he was an expert in disputation either way. And you said this ignorance of people thinking they know what they really don't know is purged by cross-examining them and showing that their opinions contradict themselves about the same things in the same ways, didn't you? Yes. And do you see what is at the root of every contradiction that is proved? No. What are you speaking of? We will make our way towards the answer to that question in due time. First, answer this. You admit that something may be proposed to be something else also besides what we name it, as all triangles can truly be said to be rectilinear, or animals breathing or self-moving. Again, you admit, do you not, that something may be proposed to be something else also besides what we name it, as triangles can truly be said to be rectilinear and not just triangles, or animals said to be breathing or self-moving? Or would you say with some older folk that think they have found some piece of wisdom, that refuse to say man is good, for example, and admit only that man is man and good is good? Yes, that is plain enough. Those are too stray to be my associates. And things may also be proved not to be something else. And things may also be proved not to be something else, as in vegetation not having blood, or that a circle can never be squared. Is that also plain enough for you? Of course. And that is reached by contradiction in the course of refutation that we are after, right? Yes. Now, does contradiction only prove that something is not something or other? Or from a contradiction, can we reach an assertion of the contrary? I guess they can be used to affirm the contradictory proposition. But normally I think of contradictions as proving a falsehood only. That is because a contradiction at least tells us that one of the two contradictory propositions is false, and that the theory that includes the contradiction is not true taken as a whole, or that the conclusion and the inference it is reached by are false. But often one of the contradictory propositions is obvious or more easily admitted. And if we know the negation is false, then we know the affirmation is true. Or if we know the affirmation is false, then we know that the negation is true. I see that now. And do you see that the answer to that question may make all the difference for us? No. Why is that? Because if refutation is only aimed at disproving propositions, then someone may question us whether we think refutation is restricted to showing that something is not, or is not such and such, and cannot say or prove anything positively that it is, or that it is such and such. Now I see how that can be a strike against us, and a fatal strike perhaps. For if it is some sophist that catches hold of us with this question, and not by our hemation, he will assuredly press us further and make us answer whether or not we admit that only proving that something is not doesn't do anything more than say that something that was said is false. And although we may be benefited by learning that something is false, nothing has been affirmed positively as true. He will ask us if our art of refutation is concerned with what is and what is true, or with what is not and what is false. Again, and a fatal strike perhaps. For if it is some sophist that catches hold of us with this question, and not by our hemation, he will assuredly press us further and make us answer whether or not we admit that only proving that something is not doesn't do anything more than say that something that was said is false. And although we may be benefited by learning that something is false, nothing has been affirmed positively as true. He will ask us if our art of refutation is concerned with what is and what is true, or with what is not and is false. And if you are in the same condition as me, we will be confounded about lovers of truth being concerned only with saying that something or other is not, or that something that someone else said is not true, and being unable to say anything else that is true about the thing in question. Might we be falling into the same trap the sophist laid for us in your conversation with the stranger, when you tried to say he was a maker of false images in speech? Might we be falling into the same trap the sophist laid for us? Might we be falling into the same trap the sophist laid for us in your conversation with the Eleatic stranger, when you tried to say he was a maker of false images in speech, and you were at a loss when the sophist was said to ask what you mean by saying what is not and what is false, how that can be anything at all? For wasn't it said that, don't you see that we're involved in a difficult investigation? For the matter of appearing but not being, and of saying things but not true ones. All this now is and always has been very perplexing, how a man is to say or think that falsehood really exists and not be involved in a contradiction. Again, might we be falling into the same trap the sophist laid for us in your conversation with this Eleatic stranger, when you tried to say he was a maker of false images in speech, and you were at a loss when the sophist was said to ask what you mean by saying what is not and saying what is false. How that can be anything at all. For wasn't it said that, don't you see that we're involved in a difficult investigation for the matter of appearing but not being, and of saying things but not true ones? All this now is and always has been very perplexing. How a man is to say or think that falsehood really exists and not be involved in a contradiction. Now he would say something similar to us, that our own skill in refutation, if it only proves that something is not, or is not something or other, doesn't say anything and isn't even speech, which is assuredly of something. Now he would say something similar to us, that our own skill in refutation, if it only proves that something is not, or is not something or other, doesn't say anything and isn't even speech, which is assuredly of something. For wasn't it said that, then we cannot even concede that such a person speaks. Rather, we should say he says nothing, or we must rather declare that he who says what is false does not speak at all, but murmurs sounds. However, we don't have to struggle through these paradoxes if disproving one proposition approves the contradictory proposition, do we? We still have to investigate that. However, we don't have to struggle through these paradoxes if disproving one proposition approves the contradictory proposition, do we? We still have to investigate that. Suppose this sophist gets us further into his grip and asks us if we prove that something is not more, if it then has to be less than whatever it's compared with, or can they be equal? Again, suppose the sophist gets us further into his grip and asks us if we prove that something is not more, if it then has to be less than whatever it's compared with, or can they be equal? Or suppose he asks us if something has to be either more or less than something else, or if they may be neither more or less, but be equals. Then, what would we know by some proof that something said is false? Or what will we know if something is proved to not be more than something else? Will that tell us that it's less than the thing in comparison, or will it even tell us that much? We will have to admit that the refusal of one proposition, that something is not more, does not transfer into an admission of the opposite proposition, that something is less. We will have to admit that the refusal of one proposition, that something is not more, does not transfer into an admission of the opposite proposition, that something is less, for it may be equal, and be neither more nor less. Then won't the sophist make us admit, according to the argument, that the dialectician's skill in refutation is restricted from approving positively the truth of any proposition, and can only prove the incoherence and falsity of a thesis that somebody else makes? Or he will say, if somebody proves that two people are not friends, does that imply that they are enemies? Or could they be neutral and entirely unacquainted with each other? We will have to say that refutation only points out that something is false through contradiction revealed by questioning, like we agreed. For I don't see how someone can be said to have to be necessarily either friends or enemies with someone else, without the possibility of them being neutral or not knowing each other at all, and being neither of the two opposites. Maybe we have to interpose and insist that there are opposites that have something that falls between them, like with the more and less and the equal, or with friends and enemies and strangers. where something is not excluded from falling somewhere between the two opposites. However, there are also opposites about which things are restricted to fall wholly either within one or the other, as with health and disease, for example. We should in turn ask the question to him, whether someone must be one or the other, either healthy or diseased, or if there is some state between those. We should in turn ask the question to him, whether someone must be one or the other, either healthy or diseased, or if there is some state he thinks is between those. What would you suppose the sophist would say to that? I think he would have to admit that someone has to be either one or the other, healthy or diseased. And that the case was different with the kind of opposites that the sophist was just said by us to introduce to the argument in order to question the value of dialectic or refutation, for being unable to go from a negation of one opposite to the affirmation of the other, from the kind of opposites we are now pointing out, where something must be either one or the other of them. Would he agree with us that there are some opposites about which anything must be either one or the other? I don't think he would refuse that some opposites are such that something in question must be either one or the other of them, and that others, like the ones he pointed out, leave open the possibility of something in question falling somewhere in between the opposition, in which case the question cannot be asked if something is either one or the other of them. Perhaps you see why this situation in the argument is to be handled as carefully as if we were handling Libyan glass or heated metal. The problem is similar to the one the stranger raised about the sophist earlier. The problem is similar to the one the Eleatic stranger raised about the sophist earlier. When he said the sophist insisted that making images and appearances of things, but not real things, which was our accusation of him, was incoherent and would be nothing more than babbling. The problem is similar to the one the Eleatic stranger raised about the sophist earlier, when he said the sophist insisted that making images and appearances of things, but not real things, which was our accusation of him, was incoherent and would be nothing more than babbling. In that case, the proposition was as familiar as any to the stranger, especially coming from the Eleatic school. And he would last of all admit that what is not and what is false can exist or be true. And yet, do you see that it was used against him, which the sophist so cleverly devised in his escape, like Aeneas escaping from the fallen walls of holy Ilium with Anchises and Ascanius? Yet how could we say that an image that isn't really the thing it appears to be, but only seems so, can be real, if it isn't really what it seems to be modeled after? Yet how could we say that an image that isn't really the thing it appears to be, but only seems so, can be real, if it isn't really what it seems to be modeled after? In this case, too, we are asked to admit the truth of a proposition that is a familiar and valuable one in our arguments about other things. In this case, too, we are asked to admit the truth of a proposition that is familiar and valuable in our arguments about other things, and yet can be used as an escape from the determination of something having to be either one or the other of two opposites, which is a target of contradiction. Or are you unfamiliar with this sophistical maneuver of denying that something must be either one or the other of two opposites, or leading the conversation to that kind of opposition and claiming that the thing in question might fall somewhere between them? Or are you unfamiliar with this sophistical maneuver of denying that something must be either one or the other of two opposites, or leading the conversation to that kind of opposition, and claiming that the thing in question might fall somewhere between them. That does seem to be a maneuver useful to escape from a determinate answer if it is defaulted to for that. And yet, we willingly admit that some opposites are such as we hypothesize the Sophist to use to interrogate us, such as more and less, which have something between them for something in question to fall between. Neither in that case more or less, but equal, don't we? Yes. And that is like one of two principles that the dialectician uses in examining opposites in the course of argument. He has to navigate through such indeterminate oppositions, such as those that lend a third possibility that falls between the opposition, with and so as to find oppositions that guarantee that something must be either one or the other of them. What is the other principle besides that? What we said it was. The other kind of opposition, the target of contradiction and refutation, the question about whether or not something is either one or the other of them, leaves nothing between them for anything in question to fall within, and thereby avoid the determination of being either one or the other of the two opposites. As regards to them, if we know that something is not one of the opposites, it has to be the other, and vice versa. Do you wish to have an example of how these different kinds of opposition are navigated through in the proper way? We can take up the same example the Sophist was said to use to try to get us to admit that oppositions contain a third possibility between them. That leaves out the ability to question if something is either one or the other of two opposites. He used as his example the more and the less. Yes, how can we navigate through that problem? We ask first if something is either equal or unequal, before asking whether it is more or less. For wouldn't you say that those, equal and unequal, have nothing between them for the things in question to be, besides one or the other of those opposites? Yes, those fall under the other class of opposites. Then, if something is not unequal, does it have to be equal? And if something is not equal, does it have to be unequal? Again, if something is not unequal, does it then have to be equal to something else? And if something is not equal, does it then have to be unequal? And aren't those contradictories? Aren't they the negation? Isn't one the negation of the other? Yes, that is clear. Then suppose we agree that it is unequal. Once that is established, we can take the liberty to ask if it is more or less, can't we? Or will the included middle that made that question open to escape from any determination that comes down to either one or the other of two things no longer be available to the answer? After we have established that something is not equal, we can ask if it is more or less with the same determination as we had with the equal and unequal, where something had to be either one or the other of them. And if it is proved to not be one of them, then it would equally be proved that it is positively the other of the two opposites. Then, like you suggested, if disproving a proposition transfers into the approval of a contradictory proposition, when there is no middle included between them, again, then as you suggested, if disproving a proposition transfers into the approval of a contradictory proposition when there is no middle included between them, then dialectic or skill in refutation will not be subject to the criticism we suppose the sophists deposit, that it is concerned with pointing out what is not and what is falsely said, and not with what is and what is true in the positive sense. By the gods, what a relief. Do you notice the subtlety of navigating through these different kinds of oppositions in dialectic? Yes, they are fine threads that are interwoven by the real dialectician. We might not be wholly out of the sophist trap, however, although we are most likely through the worst of his assault. And notice that the stranger in his conversation with the younger Socrates earlier said that we would one day have to return to the idea of some standard of the mean, without which no art or science could be possible, without which no art or science would be possible, if the more and less were compared with each other apart from any consideration of a standard or mean. Now again, we find the value in equality, or a mean between more and less. For anything was said to be reducible to either equality or inequality. For anything was said to be reducible to either equality or inequality, such that if something is not one, it must be the other of them, and vice versa. And that was not possible with the more and less, which we agreed included some mean between them that we call equal, and were indeterminate compared to the kind of opposition that must be either one or the other of the two. And from that standard of equality, like the stranger said, like the Eleatic stranger said, the deviation of error is measured and corrected in true art and science, without which there is no standard or exemplar or model with which to consider other such things in consideration to. Again, and from that standard of equality, like the Eleatic stranger said, the deviation of error is measured and corrected in true art and science, without which there is no standard or exemplar or model with which to consider other such things in consideration to, rather than towards the indefinite more and less, or in other words, to compare them with each other without the equal and the same. Now, I am sure there is more that the sophists would try to hold against us in terms of the argument thus far. Recall that at this point, we have averted the accusation of not saying positively that anything is true, but only disproving things that other people say are false, as false. Recall that at this point, we have averted the accusation of not saying positively that anything is true, but only disproving things that other people say as false. Since, as we agreed, disproving one proposition approves the contradictory proposition positively, when they aren't only what is in these arts called contraries, or opposites with an intermediary, but really contradictories, which are the negation of each other, of which if something is not one of them, it has to be the other. And we agreed that this was such a delicate subject to discern the differences in the kinds of opposition, that it is not easy to the student untrained in logic to determine if there is an escape to some opposition in question, or if there is not. And being of both these two kinds, contraries and contradictories, directing the inquiry towards a contradictory opposition, requires the foresight or at least familiarity with such distinctions. Now, suppose the sophist places under his analysis our solution to the last problem, that disproving one proposition approves the contradictory proposition, but not the contrary. To use sophistical terms common to logicians and dialecticians. Again, the contradictory means the two terms are negations of each other, where the other kind of opposition, there is an included middle. And suppose he responds after admitting all that much. And even if the proof, and suppose he responds after admitting all that much, that even if the proof of the falsehood of a proposition affirms the truth of the contradictory proposition. And suppose he responds after admitting all that much, that even if the proof of the falsehood of a proposition affirms the truth of the contradictory statement, will we not be involved in a leap from what is not, or knowing that something said is false, to what is, or knowing that something else said is true? Won't we be reaching truth and what has to be through falsity and what is impossible? And won't we be coming to know what is knowable from what is unknowable? Again, and suppose he responds after admitting all that much, that even if the proof of the falsehood of a proposition, even if the proof of the falsehood of a proposition affirms the truth of the contradictory statement, will we not be involved in a leap from what is not, or knowing that something said is false, to what is, or knowing that something else said is true? Won't we be reaching truth in what has to be through falsity and what is impossible? And won't we be coming to know what is knowable from what is unknowable, as you and the stranger agreed was incoherent earlier, and as people skilled in dialectic disagree with, claiming that the premise is prior to and holds the weight of the conclusion, and especially that there is no value in a premise that is a negation in an argument that concludes with an assertion? How should we respond? I don't know. Maybe we haven't escaped the sophist interrogation. Should I suggest a solution? Please. We should ask him if contraries aren't the focus of the same science. Take medicine, for example, and consider if anyone else is able to indicate either health or disease more accurately than the medical physician, or if the physician is only best able to point out health and someone else is supposed to be able to point out disease more accurately than he. No, the physician is most able to determine if someone is diseased also, not only if they are healthy. The physician is most able to determine both someone is diseased and if they're healthy. And again, would you admit that the general, if most able to attack a city, can also, and by the same art, best defend a city? Or the boxer, if most able to throw a punch, if really by the nature of that art, also must be most able to defend against strikes as well? Yes. Then consider if the dialectician isn't most able to determine if a proposition is false, and to also prove it to be false. Then consider again if the dialectician isn't most able to determine if a proposition is false, and to also prove it to be false by their admitted skill and refutation, and not also most able to determine if a proposition is valid, and to demonstrate that by the same art. That follows from the argument. Then there should be no problem with the dialectician being the most able to refute any argument, and at the same time and by the same art being most able to prove the truth of any proposition, or at any rate, and better yet, that they can determine the validity either way. I don't see any problem with that either. Then consider also, if you agree that the philosopher, by way of his skill in disputation, then consider also, if you agree that the philosopher, by way of this skill in disputation, then consider also, if you agree that the philosopher, by way of this skill in disputation, can purge and purify the souls of others from thinking they know what they really don't know. If they can purge and purify the souls of others from thinking they know what they don't really know. Yes, I would be more settled and at ease to affirm that about the philosopher than about the sophist. However, tell me again what you mean by this process of purification. I mean just what the Eleatic stranger described to you earlier. They question a man about the things about which he thinks he is talking sense when he is talking nonsense. I mean just what the Eleatic stranger described to you earlier. They question a man about the things about which he thinks he is talking sense when he is talking nonsense. Then they easily discover that his opinions are like those of men who wander. And in their discussions, they collect those opinions and compare them with each other. And by the comparison, they show that they contradict one another about the same things in the same respect and at the same time. Again, they question a man about the things which he thinks he is talking sense when he is talking nonsense. Then they easily discover that his opinions are like those of men who wander. And in their discussions, they collect those opinions and compare them with one another. And by the comparison, they show that they contradict one another about the same things in the same respect and at the same time. I remember that. Isn't it obvious, Theaetetus, that the same thing will never do or suffer opposites in the same respect in relation to the same thing and at the same time? Isn't it obvious, Theaetetus, that the same thing will never do or suffer opposites in the same respect in relation to the same thing and at the same time? So that if ever we find these contradictions in the functions of the mind, we shall know that it was not the same thing functioning, but a plurality. That is undeniable. Then, it is not possible for the same thing at the same time and in the same respect to be at rest and in motion. By no means, Socrates. Let us have our understanding still more precise, lest as we proceed, we become involved in dispute. If anyone should say of a man standing still but moving his hands and head, that the same man is at the same time at rest and in motion, we should not, I take it, regard that as the right way of expressing it, but rather that a part of him is at rest and a different part in motion. Is not that so? That is so. Then, if the disputant should carry the jest still further, with the subtlety that spinning tops, at any rate stands still as a whole, at the same time that they are in motion, when they have the peg fixed in one point around which they revolve, and that the same is true of any other case of circular motion about the same spot, that they both stand still and move, that they are in motion and at rest at the same time. We should reject that statement because it isn't with respect to the same parts of themselves that such things both stand still and move. It isn't in respect to the same parts of themselves that such things both stand still and move. We'd say that they have an axis and a circumference, and that with respect to the axis, they stand still, since they don't wobble to either side. while with respect to the circumference, they move in a circle. Or we might say that the whole remains in the same place, but the parts revolve. But if they do wobble to the left or right, front or back, while they are spinning, we'd say that they aren't standing still in any way. And we'd be right, Socrates. No such statement will disturb us then, or make us believe that the same thing can be, do, or undergo opposites at the same time, in the same respect, and in relation to the same thing. They won't make me believe it, at least. And didn't we say, Theaetetus, that we would eventually return to answer the question about what is at the root of every contradiction proved? That was previously said, yes. Well, what has just now been said refers to the root of proving a contradiction. That if we affirm that anything is something or other, then it is impossible to affirm the same thing to not be that which we affirmed of it. Again, this regards the root of proving a contradiction, that if we affirm that anything is something or other, then it is impossible to affirm the same thing to not be that which we affirmed of it. If we affirm that anything is something or other, then it is impossible to affirm the same thing to not be that which we affirmed of it. And similarly, if we say anything is not something or other, then it is impossible for us to make the claim that the same thing is whatever we denied of it. And is this not what Parmenides meant when he said, never let this thought prevail, that non-being is, and that being is not? But keep your mind from this way of investigation. Again, if we affirm that anything is something or other, then it is impossible to affirm the same thing to not be that which we affirmed of it. And similarly, if we say anything is not something or other, then it is impossible for us to make the claim that the same thing is whatever we denied of it. And is that not what Parmenides meant when he said, never let this thought prevail, that non-being is, and that being is not, but keep your mind from this way of investigation? That indeed seems to lay at the root of proving a contradiction. Yes, for if that were denied, the meaning of the terms we use would utterly vanish. That is, if someone could be moving and not moving. Again, yes, for if that were denied, the meaning of the terms we use would utterly vanish. That is, if someone could be moving and not moving, or walking and not walking at the same time and in the same respect, then moving and walking would be utterly meaningless. To retain the meaning of terms at all, we have to deny that something can be and not be whatever we say about it at the same time and in the same respect. That cannot be denied, Socrates. Then, to return to the point we were making, the philosopher proves that his interlocutor contradicts himself about the same things and in the same respects. But those who see this grow angry with themselves and gentle towards others. And this is the way in which they are freed from their high and obstinate opinions about themselves. The process of freeing them, moreover, affords the greatest pleasure to the listeners and the most lasting benefit to him who is subjugated to it. For just as physicians who care for the body believe that the body cannot be benefited from any food offered to it until all obstructions are removed. So, my boy, those who purge the soul believe that the soul can receive no benefit from any teaching offered to it until someone by cross-questioning reduces him who is cross-questioned to an attitude of modesty by removing the opinions that obstruct the teachings, and thus purges him and makes him think that he knows only what he knows and no more. That method of purification must indeed be the work of the philosopher. Yes, Theaetetus, and just as the stranger from Eliot told you. Yes, Theaetetus, and just as the stranger from Eliot told you earlier, we must assert that cross-questioning is the greatest and most efficacious of all purifications, and that he who is not cross-questioned, even though he be the great king, has not been purified of the greatest taints, and is therefore uneducated and deformed in those things in which he who is to be truly happy ought to be most pure and beautiful. I am under the impression, Socrates, that we have discovered the philosopher's art.